Hi guys, so we're about halfway through 2019 already, which is pretty crazy. So I thought maybe it's about time I talk about all the albums that have come out this year that I've really liked. Of course, it's unlikely that all of these albums will be on my end of year favourite albums of the year list, but for now these are what I think are the top 10 best albums that have come out this year, or at least that I've listened to. I've not listened to every album, there's loads of stuff that I've not got around to listening to, like the new Vampire Weekend album, just to name one example. So possibly by the end of the year this list will be completely different, but for now, here are the top 10. The most recent album on this list I'm going to bring up is the new Raconteurs album, Help Us Stranger. It's possible this is going to be an album that grows on me a lot more than it did, but for now I just kind of think it's really good, but definitely nowhere near as good as the first two albums. I felt like a couple of the songs were a little bit repetitive, but for the most part this is the Raconteurs doing exactly what they do really well, just that really like classic rock inspired bluesy garage rock sort of stuff. It's obviously got a lot of that Jack White sound that you know and love from him. Like the other two Raconteurs album, a lot more expansive. There's a lot more influences on show than something like one of Jack White's solo albums or the White Stripes. There's at least a couple of really good songs on this album, like the opening track Bored and Raised, which is really great, and the two early singles for the album, Sunday Drive and Now That You're Gone, which are definitely my favourite songs on the album and two of the only ones that I've really returned to a lot since its release. Like I said, it's probably going to be an album that grows on me a lot more. I've only actually listened to it the once so far, but I definitely think it's one of the better albums I've heard this year. I love the Raconteurs, and it is more of the Raconteurs, just not quite as good as the first two albums. Next up we have the new Bad Religion album, Age of Unreason. I actually was not expecting to like this album as much as I did, although I definitely really like some of the earlier Bad Religion albums like Suffer, No Control. I feel like some of their newer stuff hasn't really been that great. It's not like they've changed their sound or anything big, they're basically doing the exact same thing that they were doing back in the 80s and 90s. I just kind of felt that some of the newer albums just didn't really have that excitement and ferocity that their earlier stuff had, which is completely rectified on Age of Unreason, which I think is their best album in years. This album is exactly that hard-hitting, fast-paced, politically charged punk rock that you know from Bad Religion. They really don't sound like they've aged at all. They sound just as young and ferocious as they ever have. There's a lot of really good songs on this album, like Chaos From Within and My Sanity, which I just absolutely love those tracks. This is one of the only Bad Religion albums I've actually found myself returning to over and over again since its release. I really dig this thing. I think it's a really great, straightforward Bad Religion album, and that's exactly what we needed. At number 8 we have the album Pursuit of Modern Happiness by Yak. I'll admit that I never really listened to him until very recently, like in the last couple weeks recently. But listening to this album, I was just completely floored by how unique and interesting it is. Similar to the band Drench, they kind of blend a lot of punk rock sound with like an almost psychedelic and progressive rock sound. There are points on this album that are super aggressive and hard-hitting, just like you'd expect from a punk album, and then there's other moments that are very experimental and almost sound like they've been listening to loads of like Pink Floyd or even newer bands, like newer psychedelic bands like King Gizzard. It's a very fascinating, interesting album full of some really great songs. I definitely see this being one that I return to a lot more over the next few months, and it may even be higher up on the list by the time I finish the year. Next up we have the new Band of Skulls album, Love Is All You Love. An album that seemed to have gotten a lot of very mixed reception from people, but I personally thought it was a really damn solid album. I've always had a huge soft spot for Band of Skulls. They're easily one of my favourite blues rock bands of the last decade, and although it's nowhere near as good as their first couple albums, I definitely think it completely trumps By Default, their last album. It definitely has very little of the blues rock sort of sounds that you kind of know from Band of Skulls, and they've definitely taken a larger influence from pop rock and new wave, and also a little bit of glam rock in there as well. There's never a point on this album where I was like, that's really interesting, that's completely new, I've never heard anything like that before. But what the album did well was it's full of a collection of really catchy, fun pop rock songs that I really enjoyed. It doesn't break any new boundaries, it doesn't do anything unique or different, it doesn't even do anything that the band haven't really done before, but their songwriting is just as good as it ever has been. There's some really damn good songs on this, like the title track, like Carnivorous, Cool Your Battles, which is one of my favourite songs of the year. If you like Band of Skulls, this is Band of Skulls. They don't do anything interesting or different, but it's really fun. Next up we have the new album from Emarosa called Peach Club. I'll admit that I haven't actually listened to any other Emarosa album. I've heard a couple songs here and there, and I kind of felt that it was a little bit just that generic post-hardcore sort of stuff that can be good and sometimes, in fact a lot of the time, can just kind of be generic and uninspired. But this album shows them definitely going into a much more pop heavy direction, which obviously divided a lot of people, but I think it really served these guys well. They definitely have a keen sense for writing these catchy and upbeat pop songs. There are these really funky bass riffs on the album which sound incredible. I love the vocals. There's some incredible hooks on this that are really, really catchy, like Giving Up and Don't Cry, which are two of my favourite hooks from any song this year. Again, this isn't an album that breaks any new boundaries or does anything different, but it's a charming, fun little pop rock album that I personally really enjoyed. Next up we have the album Drama by Dave. Dave's a British rapper. I talked about this album earlier in the year when I did a review of loads of albums that I missed, and although I was very, very positive towards the album and called it like one of, if not the best album of the year, over time I definitely think my opinion on it has kind of devolved a little bit. I'll admit that I haven't actually listened to the full thing since I did that review, so it's possibly a case of I need to listen to it again, because maybe I'll realise it is really great. But just because of how emotional and depressing it is, I've never really wanted to go back and listen to it because it put me in such a bad mood the first time. The album is full of these very grimy sort of beats. It's clearly inspired by a lot of the other like grime artists around today, but there's also a clear influence from other modern US hip-hop artists, especially Kendrick Lamar. There were many points on this that I was listening to it and I got very strong To Pimp a Butterfly vibes, especially in how Dave kind of makes this very cinematic experience. The album kind of chronicles Dave's struggles with depression and anxiety in a way that very few rappers do. I think it's very interesting. It's full of some really beautifully hard-hitting lyrics. The beats aren't anything mind-blowing or anything, but there are a few moments where I thought they were really, really good and the production served the songs well. When it comes to hip-hop, this is probably the best album I've heard in the genre this year, although I have not heard the new Tyler, the Creator album, so when I listen to that, maybe I'll completely change my mind. But for now, this is it. Next up, we have the album Be Content by Indoor Pets. I've been a big fan of Indoor Pets for a long, long time, so I was really excited for them to finally release their debut album, and it was exactly what I was expecting them to do. That very crisp, catchy, bouncy indie rock sort of stuff, clearly inspired by bands like Weezer. There's definitely a strong power pop sound to it, mixed in with the very crunchy and light indie rock guitar riffs. The lyrics are very self-deprecating and at times can be really, really funny. Production-wise, the album is just really, really beautifully sounding. There's like almost no songs on this album that I didn't like. I think it's a perfect painting of these guys' talents at songwriting. There's some really, really catchy songs. I definitely can see these guys getting big in the next few years. This album is a lot of fun and one that I highly recommend if you're into modern day indie rock. Next up, we have the first part of the Everything Not Saved Will Be Lost double album by Foals. So the second part of this album comes out in the next couple months, I believe. So So far we've only got the first part, and if the second part's as good as the first part, this could be something really special. I love Foals, especially their first two albums, Antidotes and Total Life Forever, and this album I don't think is anywhere near as good as those albums, or even really what went down their last album, but man, this is a really damn good album still. It mixes that indie rock, kind of almost Talking Heads inspired sounds that they've had over their, especially their earlier albums, and it kind of adds in this whole new like modern dance music aspects to it. It's clearly inspired by like house and electronica, which their previous albums definitely weren't. They've always had sort of a dance punk math rock sort of underlying theme, especially in their first few albums, and that kind of rears its head a lot more in this album as they throw in a lot of more electronic sort of sounds, and it definitely is very fascinating. This album has some of the band's best songs like White Onions, Exits, On the Luna, which is a much more like almost 80s synth pop inspired song. Production wise, instrumentally, this album is just absolutely top notch. I really enjoyed it. I keep going back to this album because I just really love it. It's a fantastic album, one of the best rock albums of the year. Next up we have an album that I actually missed initially in the year and discovered very later on. An album that I didn't expect to like as much as I did, but it's actually been one of my most listened to albums this year. It's the album When We All Fall Asleep, Where Do We Go by Billie Eilish. Billie Eilish has definitely turned a lot of people's heads for better or worse. People really seem to either really like her music or just absolutely hate it. I, of course, are on the former of that too. I loved this album. I think she has a very interesting, dark sort of sound, clearly inspired by a lot of modern pop and trap music and a lot of the bigger people around today, but she adds in this almost gothic rock sort of sound at times, especially in songs like Bury a Friend, which is scattered with these very like horror sounding sound effects. There's this underlining theme of darkness and depression throughout the album, which you don't really expect from a pop album like this. The album is very somber, low key, but it's really well produced, has some of the best choruses from any song of the year. Songs like Bad Guy, Bury a Friend, When the Party's Over, one of my favourite songs of the year. All are absolutely incredible, really catchy sing-along songs that know exactly how to hit you emotionally. I think the slower songs are definitely where the album succeeds the most, especially with songs like When the Party's Over and I Love You, two of my favourite songs of the year. The songwriting on this album is really great. Billie's voice is fantastic. Apart from a few issues here and there that I have, especially on the song My Strange Addiction, which has that weird sampling of The Office, which I don't really think works. This album is a near perfect pop album. It's easily the best pop album I've heard this year, and I definitely see this being very high up on the list at the end of the year. And finally, my number one pick for the year so far is the new Swimmers album, Berkeley's on Fire. I really liked the album Drive North, their first album when that came out, and it's one that I've kind of grown to more and more over the years, but Berkeley's on Fire was one that I found gripped me instantly and just pulled me right in. Even from the early pre-album singles like the title track and Trash Bag Baby, two of the best songs on the album. The album brings back a lot of that pop punk, beach punk sort of sound of their first album and definitely sprinkles in a lot more of that very political Bad Religion sort of sound. It's definitely a much more straightforward punk album than their previous album, but they also add a lot of almost hip-hop influences, especially on the final song Steve Got Robbed, which at times is almost like a Beastie Boys song. The album is way more mature than their last album, has a lot of really important political messages throughout, really great instrumentation, fantastic production. I don't think there's really any problem I have with this album except for maybe the slower songs not really being as good as the other songs. But even then, like, the songs that I originally disliked on the album have grown on me a lot more, especially after seeing them live on the tour for this album. I really like this album. I'm not sure if it will stay number one at the end of the year, but who knows, maybe it will, maybe it will end up still being my favourite album of the year. I guess only time will tell. Thanks for watching this little top 10 albums so far video. Hopefully I'll be getting more album reviews out in the future, and I'm definitely looking forward to doing a final list at the end of the year, which surprisingly isn't that far away. Hopefully you guys enjoyed this video. Also, don't forget to go subscribe to my new horror movie video essay channel called The Horror Textbook, which I've got a video all about jump scares on now. Hopefully you guys go and enjoy that. I've been getting some positive feedback so far, and it was a lot of fun to make, so I'm looking forward to making more videos for that channel. Thanks for watching, guys, and I'll see you next time.